May 12, 1969. 08:47 hours. A Shau Valley, Thua Thien Province, Republic of Vietnam. Specialist 4 Michael J. Hartmann, rifleman with Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, crouched in the elephant grass 6 kilometers southwest of Hill 937, listening to the jungle breathe. The monsoon rains had ended 3 days earlier, leaving the valley floor sodden and steaming under a sun that hadn't yet burned through the morning mist. He was 22 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, where the loudest sound was the church bell on Sunday mornings. Here, the loudest sound was the thump of his own heartbeat, competing with the distant rotors of Huey helicopters and the occasional crack of distant small arms fire echoing off the karst ridges that ringed the valley like prison walls. Operation Apache Snow had kicked off 2 days earlier on May 10th, with 5 battalions combat assaulting into the A Shau, a 17-mile-long infiltration corridor that the North Vietnamese Army had controlled since 1966. The mission was straightforward in briefing, brutal in execution: find and destroy PAVN forces, disrupt supply lines feeding south from Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and deny the enemy the sanctuary they'd used to launch attacks on Hue and Da Nang during Tet the year before. Intelligence estimates suggested 2 PAVN regiments were operating in the valley. The 29th and elements of the 6th dug into bunker complexes and trench systems built over 3 years of occupation. The terrain was their ally: triple canopy jungle so dense that aerial reconnaissance was nearly useless, slopes so steep that resupply helicopters had to hover and kick out ammunition crates rather than land, and vegetation so thick that visibility dropped to 10 meters in some sectors. Hartmann carried an M16A1 rifle, 20 magazines of 5.56mm ammunition, 4 fragmentation grenades, 2 smoke canisters, a canteen that was already half empty, and a pocket-sized Bible his mother had pressed into his hand at the Philadelphia airport 11 months earlier. He'd arrived in-country in June 1968, processed through the 90th Replacement Battalion at Long Binh, and joined the 101st at Camp Eagle near Hue in the Northern Reese Corps Tactical Zone. His first taste of combat had come during Operation Nevada Eagle, a long series of sweeps through the lowlands, where contact was sporadic and the real enemy was heat, leeches, and the weight of the rucksack that dug into his shoulders like a penance. The A Shau was different. Everyone knew it. The valley had a reputation. It was where the Special Forces camp had been overrun in '66, where previous operations had bled units white and achieved nothing permanent. The NVA owned this ground, and they intended to keep it. Bravo Company had inserted by helicopter the previous morning, landing in a clearing designated LZ Vicky, 3 kilometers east of their current position. The insertion had been cold, no enemy fire, but within 2 hours of moving west toward their assigned sector, they'd begun finding signs: fresh footprints in the mud, bamboo stakes sharpened and angled toward likely approach routes, and once, a cache of rice and medical supplies hastily abandoned, the bandages still smelling of antiseptic. Lieutenant Myers, the platoon leader, a wiry Texan on his second tour, had ordered them to move slowly, maintain noise discipline, and keep interval. The jungle swallowed sound, but it also amplified mistakes. A careless footfall, the metallic click of a weapon's safety, the cough of a soldier who'd been smoking too many cigarettes. Any of these could draw fire. Now, as Hartmann waited for the order to move, he studied the man in front of him, Private First Class Rodriguez, a kid from Los Angeles who talked endlessly about his girlfriend and a '67 Camaro he was going to buy when he got back to the world. Behind Hartmann was Corporal Davies, a quiet black soldier from Georgia who'd extended his tour to save money for college, and who never complained, even when the dysentery hit and half the platoon was shitting blood. These men were his family now. The ones back home wrote letters that took 2 weeks to arrive and felt like transmissions from another planet. His father's concerns about the hardware store's inventory, his younger sister's high school graduation. These things mattered, he reminded himself, but they felt abstract, unreal. What was real was the mud caking his boots, the weight of the rifle in his hands, and the sick certainty that somewhere in the green maze ahead, men with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades were waiting. The radio crackled. Lieutenant Myers' voice, clipped and professional, ordered the platoon to advance in staggered column toward a ridgeline designated Checkpoint Tango. Hartmann rose, felt his knees protest, and began moving. The jungle closed in immediately. Vines snagged his rucksack. Thorns tore at his fatigues. The air was thick, wet, hard to breathe, as if the valley itself was exhaling rot and decay. Above, the canopy filtered the sunlight into a dim green twilight that made it impossible to judge time. His watch said it was nearly 900 hours, but it could have been dawn or dusk for all the light that reached the forest floor. They moved for an hour without incident. The only sounds were the squelch of boots in mud, the occasional whisper of the radio, and the incessant buzz of insects that swarmed around their faces and necks, drawn by sweat and the salt of their skin. Hartmann's mind wandered. He thought about the letter he'd received 3 days earlier, the one from his high school sweetheart Karen, who'd written to say she was engaged to someone else, a guy who worked at the mill and wasn't halfway around the world in a jungle that didn't make sense to anyone back home. He'd read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket, where it sat now like a stone. He wasn't angry. He was too tired to be angry. Anger required energy, and energy was a commodity in short supply. At 10:15 hours, everything changed. The point man, Sergeant Kowalski, a veteran with 180 days left in country, raised his fist, the signal to freeze. Hartmann dropped to one knee, scanning the jungle ahead. For a moment, there was nothing. Then he saw it. A bunker, low and expertly camouflaged with logs and earth, its firing slit barely visible beneath a tangle of vines. Before anyone could react, the jungle erupted. The bunker opened fire. The distinctive crack of an AK-47 followed immediately by the heavier thump of a PK machine gun. Rounds snapped through the air, clipping leaves and splintering bamboo. Kowalski went down, hit in the chest. Rodriguez dove left, returning fire. Hartmann dropped flat, his face pressed into the mud, the smell of cordite and vegetation filling his nose. The firefight became chaos. Voices shouting. The metallic chatter of M16s on full automatic. The crump of grenades. Lieutenant Myers was on the radio, calling for artillery support, his voice steady despite the hell breaking loose around him. Hartmann crawled forward, found cover behind a fallen log, and began firing at the muzzle flashes erupting from the bunker. The M16 bucked in his hands, spent casings arced through the air. His ears rang. Time compressed. Seconds felt like hours. He changed magazines, his fingers shaking, and kept firing. Then the jungle behind the bunker came alive. More NVA soldiers, dressed in khaki uniforms and pith helmets, emerged from spider holes and concealed positions, firing RPGs and small arms. Bravo Company was caught in a kill zone, a pre-planned ambush designed to channel them into interlocking fields of fire. Davies, still behind Hartmann, was hit in the leg and screamed. The medic, a soft-spoken kid from Ohio everyone called Doc, crawled forward under fire, dragging his aid bag. Hartmann provided covering fire, burning through another magazine, his weapon hot to the touch. The artillery arrived 10 minutes later. 155mm rounds from Firebase Blaze, 8 kilometers to the east. The first salvo fell short, shaking the earth and sending geysers of mud into the air. Myers adjusted fire, and the next rounds landed on target, walking through the bunker complex and silencing the PK gun. The NVA began to withdraw, fading back into the jungle with the discipline of professional soldiers who'd been fighting for years. Hartmann kept firing until his rifle clicked empty, then reloaded and fired again, his mind blank, operating on training and adrenaline. When the firing stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. Hartmann lay there, gasping, his hands trembling. Around him, the jungle was torn and smoking. Kowalski was dead. Davies was screaming for Doc. 3 others were wounded. The platoon had survived, but barely. Lieutenant Myers called in a medevac, and within 20 minutes, a Huey descended through the canopy, its rotor wash flattening the grass, and lifted out the wounded. Hartmann watched them go, their faces pale and shocked, and wondered when his turn would come. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, on May 15th, Bravo Company was ordered to assault Hill 937, a ridge the maps called Dong Ap Bia, but which would soon earn a different name, Hamburger Hill. The hill had no strategic value, but intelligence believed the Pavan 29th Regiment was dug in on its slopes, and command wanted them destroyed. The assault began at first light. Hartmann climbed with his platoon, every step a battle against the gradient and the mud and the fire pouring down from above. The NVA had turned the hill into a fortress, bunkers reinforced with logs, trenches connecting fighting positions, fields of fire cleared to kill anyone foolish enough to advance. Bravo Company attacked, was driven back, regrouped, and attacked again. The cycle repeated for days. Men died. Replacements arrived and died. The hill became a meat grinder, chewing through soldiers and spitting out bodies. On the third day of the assault, May 17th, Hartmann was moving up the slope with his fire team when the mortar round hit. He didn't hear it coming. One moment he was climbing, the next he was airborne, weightless, the world spinning in a kaleidoscope of green and brown and red. He hit the ground hard, his breath gone, his ears screaming. Pain arrived a second later, a white-hot agony that radiated from his left arm. He looked down and saw blood, too much blood, soaking his sleeve and pooling in the mud beneath him. His arm was wrong, twisted at an angle that didn't make sense, bone visible through torn flesh. He tried to move it and screamed. Doc appeared, his face tight with concentration. He cut away Hartmann's sleeve, applied a tourniquet, and injected morphine. The pain receded to a dull roar. Hartmann heard Doc talking, his voice calm, professional, telling him he was going to be okay, that the medevac was inbound, that he just needed to hold on. But Hartmann could see the truth in Doc's eyes. The arm was gone. Maybe not physically, not yet, but functionally, irrevocably gone. His war was over, and in a strange way he felt relief. Before we continue this story, a story built on the real sacrifices of men like those who fought in the A Shau Valley in 1969, tell us where you're listening from and how old you are. These memories belong to all of us, and knowing who carries them forward matters. Your support helps ensure stories like this reach everyone who needs to hear them. Perfeito. Agora vou escrever o bloco 2. Conflict em inglês, com exatamente 2.000 palavras, mantendo o rigor histórico sobre procedimentos médicos, evacuação e o conflito interno do veterano. The medevac Hui arrived within 12 minutes, descending through a gap in the canopy that enemy fire had conveniently cleared during the previous day's bombardment. The pilot held the helicopter in a hover 3 feet off the ground, while Doc and 2 other soldiers lifted Hartmann onto a stretcher and slid him through the open door. The crew chief, a specialist with a 1,000-yard stare and dried blood on his gloves, grabbed the stretcher and secured it to the deck with practiced efficiency. Hartmann caught a glimpse of the sky, clean, blue, impossibly distant, before the morphine pulled him under and the world dissolved into fragments. The throb of rotor blades, voices shouting medical terminology he didn't understand, hands pressing bandages against his arm, and pain that lived somewhere beneath the chemical fog. Waiting. He woke in the 85th Evacuation Hospital at Pubai, 15 kilometers south of Hue, a sprawling complex of Quonset huts and tents that processed the broken bodies flowing out of I-Corps like an assembly line in reverse. The surgeons worked in shifts, operating around the clock, their scrubs perpetually stained, their faces etched with exhaustion that no amount of coffee could erase. Hartmann's surgery lasted 4 hours. The chief surgeon, a major named Kellerman who'd trained at Johns Hopkins before volunteering for Vietnam, later told him that the mortar fragment had severed the brachial artery, shattered the humerus in 3 places, and destroyed the radial and ulnar nerves beyond repair. They'd tried to save the arm. They'd spent 2 hours trying, but the tissue damage was too extensive, the blood loss too severe, the risk of infection too high. At 22:30 hours on May 17, 1969, Major Kellerman made the decision to amputate 6 inches below the shoulder. When Hartmann woke again, the arm was gone. He knew before he looked. The absence had weight, a phantom presence that his brain couldn't reconcile with the reality his eyes confirmed. The stump was wrapped in white gauze, already spotted with seepage, and secured in a sling that kept it elevated to reduce swelling. A drainage tube snaked from beneath the dressing into a collection bag hanging from the side of the bed. The pain was different now. Sharper, more localized, but also paradoxically distant, as if it belonged to someone else. The morphine helped, delivered through an IV line that fed into his right arm, but it also brought nightmares. The jungle, the hill, the explosion, the blood, all looping endlessly like a film reel stuck on repeat. The ward was full of men like him, men missing legs, arms, eyes. Men with chest tubes and colostomy bags and faces wrapped in bandages that left only slits for breathing. The nurses moved between beds with quiet competence, changing dressings, administering medication, offering water and words of comfort that felt both genuine and inadequate. One of them, a first lieutenant named Patterson from Oregon, checked Hartmann's vitals twice a day and spoke to him in a voice that reminded him of his mother, calm, steady, anchored in a world where things made sense. She told him he was lucky. The phrase felt obscene. Lucky would have been missing the mortar. Lucky would have been rotating home in June like he was supposed to, with both arms and no nightmares. But he understood what she meant. Lucky meant alive. Lucky meant not in a body bag on a C-130 flying to Dover Air Force Base. The days blurred together. Physical therapy began on the third day post-op, a brutal regimen designed to maintain range of motion in his shoulder and prevent the stump from contracting. The therapist, a sergeant named Willis who'd been a college football player before the war, was relentless but fair, pushing Hartmann through exercises that left him sweating and nauseous but also, grudgingly, grateful. Willis had seen hundreds of amputees cycle through Pubai, and he knew the difference between pain that signaled damage and pain that signaled healing. He taught Hartmann how to dress himself one-handed, how to eat, how to perform basic tasks that he'd never thought about before losing the ability to do them. Each small victory, buttoning a shirt, tying a boot, felt monumental and humiliating in equal measure. The psychological conflict was harder than the physical. Hartmann had defined himself as a soldier, a rifleman, a man who carried his weight and did his job. The army had given him identity, purpose, a clear role in a confusing world. Now that identity was gone, amputated along with his arm. He was damaged goods, a liability, useless. The thought circled his mind like a vulture. At night, when the morphine wore thin and sleep wouldn't come, he lay in the dark and listened to the other men in the ward, some snoring, some crying, some simply breathing in and out with the mechanical rhythm of men who'd forgotten why they were doing it. He wondered what he would tell his father, a World War II veteran who'd stormed Omaha Beach and never talked about it, except to say that a man did his duty. He wondered what he would do back in Pennsylvania, where the only jobs were in mills and mines and stores, all of which required two hands. The phantom pain started on the 5th day. It was the cruelest joke. His brain insisted the arm was still there, still hurt, still needed attention. He would wake in the night, convinced he could feel his fingers clenching, his wrist twisting, his elbow bending. He would reach to scratch an itch that didn't exist and find only empty air and the bandaged stump. The doctors explained it was normal, that the nerves were misfiring, that it would fade with time. But time felt like another casualty, something that had stopped making sense on Hill 937 when the mortar hit and the world split into before and after. Letters arrived from home. His mother wrote every other day, long rambling updates about the weather and church socials and his sister's plans for college, carefully avoiding any mention of the war or his injury until the last paragraph, where she would write in uppercase, "We are so proud of you and we love you and come home safe." His father wrote once, a single page in cramped handwriting that said the hardware store was doing fine, the Phillies were having a rough season, and that Hartmann had done his duty, and that was enough. Karen, his ex-girlfriend, sent a card, a generic get-well-soon card with flowers on the front, and a note inside that said she was sorry and that she hoped he'd understand. He burned the card in an ashtray and never replied. The other soldiers in the ward became his touchstone. There was Corporal Jenkins, a tanker from the 1st Cavalry Division, who'd lost both legs when his M48 hit a mine near Quan Loy. Jenkins was 23, black from Detroit, and angrier than anyone Hartmann had ever met. Angry at the war, the army, the politicians who'd sent them, and the country that would forget them. He ranted for hours, his voice rising and falling, and no one tried to stop him because he was saying what they were all thinking. There was Private McCaffrey, 18 years old, from Boston, who'd been in country for 6 weeks before an RPG took his right arm and left eye. McCaffrey didn't talk much. He just stared at the ceiling with his remaining eye and flinched whenever a helicopter flew overhead. And there was Specialist Diaz, a medic from Texas who'd been treating a wounded Marine when a sniper shot him through the spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Diaz had saved 17 men during his tour. Now he couldn't walk. They shared their stories in fragments, late at night when the nurses dimmed the lights and the ward settled into uneasy quiet. Hartmann told them about Hamburger Hill, about the 10 days of assaults that had killed 72 Americans and wounded over 300 more. About the moment his platoon finally reached the summit on May 20th and found nothing but empty bunkers and abandoned equipment because the NVA had withdrawn during the night. He told them about the feeling of standing on that goddamn hill, one arm gone, and realizing they'd bled for dirt that command would abandon within a month because it had no strategic value, no purpose beyond killing the enemy who'd simply moved to another valley and started over. The bitterness in his voice surprised him, but no one in the ward judged. They'd all bled for hills and villages and grid coordinates that meant nothing to anyone back home. The defining moment came 2 weeks into his recovery. A chaplain visited the ward, a soft-spoken captain with a cross on his collar and a Bible in his hand. He moved from bed to bed, offering prayers and consolation, and when he reached Hartmann, he asked if there was anything he needed, anything he wanted to talk about. Hartmann looked at him for a long moment, then asked the question that had been eating him alive. Why did God let this happen? The chaplain didn't have an answer. He offered platitudes about suffering and purpose and faith, but Hartmann could see the doubt in his eyes, the same doubt that lived in every man in that ward. When the chaplain left, Hartmann felt something shift inside him. Not acceptance, that would come later, if it came at all, but a recognition that he was alone with this, that no authority, religious or military, could make sense of what had happened. The Army processed him efficiently. On June 3, 1969, 17 days after the amputation, Hartmann was medically evacuated to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., along with 30 other wounded soldiers. The flight took 24 hours, with refueling stops in Japan and Alaska, and he slept most of the way, drugged and dreamless. Walter Reed was different from Pubai, cleaner, quieter, more sterile, but the wounds were the same. He spent 3 months there, undergoing additional surgeries to revise the stump and prepare it for a prosthetic, enduring more physical therapy, attending mandatory psychiatric evaluations where doctors asked him about his feelings, and he lied, because telling the truth felt like surrender. He learned to hate the prosthetic arm they fitted him with, a crude mechanical thing with a hook instead of a hand, operated by a shoulder harness that dug into his skin and required conscious effort to manipulate. It was functional, but inhuman, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. The other veterans at Walter Reed were his only comfort. They understood in ways no civilian could. They'd been there, or somewhere like it, and they carried the same weight. They formed an unspoken brotherhood, bonded not by pride or patriotism, but by shared trauma and the knowledge that they'd survived something most people couldn't imagine. They played cards, traded stories, and attended group therapy sessions where they sat in a circle and pretended that talking about it helped. Sometimes it did. More often, it didn't. In August, Hartmann was granted 30 days leave before his medical discharge would be finalized. He went home to Pennsylvania, to the small town where nothing had changed and everything was different. His family threw a welcome home party. Friends and neighbors came, shook his remaining hand, and said they were proud of him, that he was a hero. He smiled and thanked them and felt like a fraud. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy who'd been in the wrong place when a mortar landed, who'd survived while better men died, who'd lost an arm fighting for a hill the army gave back to the enemy. At night, alone in his childhood bedroom, he would wake up reaching for his rifle, his heart pounding, convinced he was back in the A Shau with the jungle closing in and the NVA coming through the wire. The war hadn't ended just because he'd left Vietnam. It lived in his head, replaying endlessly, a conflict he couldn't win or escape. The real battle, he realized, wasn't the one he'd fought on Hamburger Hill. It was the one he was fighting now, every day, against the depression and the rage and the phantom pain that refused to fade. It was the battle to find meaning in the loss, to rebuild an identity from the wreckage, to believe that there was still a life worth living on the other side of the trauma. And unlike the war in Vietnam, this battle had no artillery support, no medevac, no brothers covering his flanks. He was on his own. On September 15, 1969, Specialist 4 Michael J. Hartmann received his honorable discharge from the United States Army at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The ceremony was brief, perfunctory. A handshake from a colonel he'd never met. A folder containing his DD-214 discharge papers, a Purple Heart and Bronze Star with V device that felt heavier than they should, and a final salute that closed the door on a chapter of his life he'd never asked to write. He was 22 years old, permanently disabled, and adrift in a country that had moved on while he was bleeding in the A Shau Valley. The news was dominated by Woodstock, the moon landing, and the rising anti-war movement that painted soldiers like him as either victims or villains, never simply as men who'd answered the call. He returned to Pennsylvania with a duffel bag, a prosthetic arm he barely used, and nightmares that arrived with clockwork regularity at 0300 hours every night. The first year was survival. Hartmann moved into a small apartment above his father's hardware store in a town where everyone knew his name and nobody knew what to say to him. The looks were the hardest part, the mixture of pity and discomfort that flickered across faces when people saw the empty sleeve pinned to his shirt. Some would approach with forced cheerfulness, thanking him for his service in voices that rang hollow. Others would cross the street to avoid conversation. Children stared openly until their parents pulled them away, whispering warnings about politeness. Hartmann learned to navigate the social minefield by becoming invisible, shopping early in the morning when stores were empty, avoiding the diner where veterans from previous wars gathered to trade stories he couldn't bear to hear. He tried working at the hardware store, sorting inventory and manning the register, but the simple tasks that required two hands became exercises in frustration and humiliation. Stocking shelves one-handed meant items fell and shattered. Operating the cash register meant fumbling with bills while customers waited with thinning patience. His father never complained, never criticized, but Hartmann could see the concern etched deeper into the old man's face with each passing week. The unspoken question hung between them. What now? What future existed for a one-armed combat veteran with a high school diploma and skills that translated to nothing in the civilian world? The nightmares intensified. The same dream, variations on a theme. He was back on Hamburger Hill, climbing through the mud and the fire, watching men die, feeling the mortar impact, seeing his arm torn away in slow motion, while he screamed into a void that swallowed all sound. He would wake drenched in sweat, his remaining hand clutching phantom dog tags, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Sleep became something to fear, rather than seek. He started drinking. Beer at first, then whiskey. Anything to dull the edges and quiet the voices of dead men who visited him in the dark. By Christmas 1969, he was consuming a fifth of Jack Daniels every 3 days, hiding bottles in places his father wouldn't look, and telling himself he was managing fine. The breaking point came on a February night in 1970. Hartmann had been drinking steadily since noon, sitting in his apartment with the lights off, when fireworks from a nearby celebration pierced the silence. His mind didn't register fireworks. It registered incoming mortars, machine gun fire, the crack of AK-47s. He dove for cover behind the couch, his body moving on trained instinct, and stayed there for 20 minutes, trembling and nauseous, before reality reasserted itself. When his father found him an hour later, still on the floor, stinking of whiskey and shame, the old man didn't say a word. He just sat down beside him, this World War II veteran who'd never talked about Normandy, and put a hand on his son's shoulder. They sat there in silence until dawn, 2 generations of broken soldiers finding wordless communion in shared trauma. The next week, his father made calls. He contacted the Veterans Administration, local veteran support groups, and an old Army buddy who'd become a counselor specializing in combat trauma. He pushed through Hartmann's resistance with the quiet determination of a man who'd watched too many brothers come home from war, only to lose the battle at home. In March 1970, Hartmann began attending group therapy sessions at a VA facility in Pittsburgh, an hour's drive that his father made with him every Tuesday evening. The first session was excruciating. Sitting in a circle with 8 other Vietnam veterans, all carrying invisible wounds alongside the visible ones, and being asked to talk about feelings felt like another kind of combat, one where the enemy was himself. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. Listening to other men describe the same nightmares, the same guilt, the same rage, Hartmann realized he wasn't crazy. He wasn't weak. He was injured in ways the Army had no manual for treating. The group leader, a former Marine named Patterson who'd lost his legs at Khe Sanh, didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. He offered tools, breathing techniques for panic attacks, strategies for managing intrusive thoughts, and the radical concept that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about learning to carry the weight without being crushed by it. It wasn't quick. It wasn't linear. Some weeks Hartmann attended sessions and felt worse leaving than arriving. Other weeks, he'd drive home with something approaching hope flickering in his chest. Physical rehabilitation continued in parallel. The prosthetic technology of 1969 was crude, but the VA fitted him with an improved myoelectric prosthesis in 1971, a device that used electrical signals from his remaining muscles to control a mechanical hand. It was still clumsy, still required conscious effort, but it was functional in ways the hook had never been. He practiced obsessively, picking up coins, writing, using tools, rebuilding fine motor skills from nothing. The therapist, a woman named Chen who'd worked with amputees for a decade, pushed him past frustration into competence. She taught him that disability wasn't absence but adaptation, that his value as a human being wasn't measured in limbs but in resilience and choice. Education became his path forward. In fall 1971, using his GI Bill benefits, Hartmann enrolled at a community college 30 miles from home, pursuing a degree in accounting, a field where precision mattered more than physical strength. The transition was jarring. He was older than most students, marked by experience they couldn't fathom, sitting in classrooms while his mind sometimes drifted back to rice paddies and fire-base perimeters. But the structure helped. Assignments had deadlines. Problems had solutions. Success was quantifiable. Slowly, he built a new identity. Not soldier, not victim, but student, then graduate, then accountant. The emotional resolution came in stages, measured in small victories rather than dramatic revelations. In 1973, he met Susan, a nurse at the VA hospital who'd tended to his phantom pain during an appointment. She was widowed, her husband killed in a car accident 2 years earlier, and she understood loss in ways that required no explanation. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared silence as much as conversation. She didn't flinch from his scars, didn't treat him as broken, and didn't expect him to be anything other than who he was, a man still fighting battles most people couldn't see. They married in 1974 in a small ceremony attended by family and a few veterans from his therapy group. Work provided stability. In 1975, Hartmann joined a small accounting firm in Pittsburgh that specialized in serving veteran-owned businesses. His boss, himself a Korean War veteran, understood that some days were harder than others, that the sound of a helicopter could trigger a flashback, that certain dates, May 17th, May 20th, would always carry weight. The firm became more than employment. It became community, a space where his military experience was asset rather than liability. He advanced slowly but steadily, eventually becoming a partner in 1982. Fatherhood arrived in 1976 with the birth of his daughter, Emily, followed by a son, David, in 1978. Holding Emily for the first time, feeling her tiny weight against his chest, Hartmann experienced something he hadn't felt since before the war: uncomplicated joy. The responsibility was terrifying. How could he protect these children when he'd failed to protect the men in his platoon? How could he teach them about courage and integrity when he still woke screaming from nightmares? But Susan anchored him, reminding him that being a father didn't require perfection, only presence. He learned to change diapers one-handed, to hold bottles while reading stories, to coach Little League with a prosthetic hand that occasionally malfunctioned to his kids' delighted laughter. The nightmares never completely stopped, but they changed texture. By the 1980s, they diminished from nightly occurrences to weekly, then monthly. Therapy continued, evolving from crisis management to long-term processing. Hartmann learned that the guilt he carried, survivor's guilt, the therapists called it, was common among combat veterans, that the men who died on Hamburger Hill wouldn't want him to spend his life as a casualty too. He started attending memorial services, reconnecting with surviving members of Bravo Company at reunions where they'd stand in hotel conference rooms and remember brothers who never made it home. The connections were painful, but necessary. Acknowledgement that what they'd endured mattered, that the men they'd lost deserved more than silence. In 1989, 20 years after the amputation, Hartmann made a pilgrimage to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. He stood before the black granite wall, searching through the names until he found them. Kowalski, McCaffrey, Davies, and 43 others from his battalion who died in the A Shau Valley campaign. He traced their names with his remaining hand and wept openly, finally giving himself permission to grieve without shame. Susan stood beside him, silent and steady, while their children waited respectfully, beginning to understand the weight their father carried. The resolution wasn't Hollywood. No dramatic catharsis. No moment of perfect clarity where the pain vanished and life became simple. It was messier, more gradual, built from thousands of small choices to keep moving forward even when standing still seemed easier. It was learning that strength wasn't about never falling, but about getting up each time. It was accepting that he would always be a Vietnam veteran, that the war would always be part of him, but it didn't have to define him completely. He was also a husband, a father, an accountant, a friend, a man who'd survived and chosen to build something meaningful from the wreckage. By the time he retired in 2005, Hartmann had helped dozens of veteran-owned businesses navigate finances, had raised 2 children who became teachers, had stayed married to a woman who'd seen him at his worst and loved him anyway, and had lived a full life that the 22-year-old on Hamburger Hill could never have imagined possible. The arm was still gone. The scars, physical and psychological, remained. But he'd found what every combat veteran seeks, a way to live with what happened, to honor the fallen by refusing to become another casualty, to prove that survival could be more than just breathing. The resolution was this. Michael J. Hartmann, who'd lost his arm in a jungle battle in 1969, had found his life. Michael J. Hartmann passed away on November 8, 2018, at the age of 71, surrounded by family in the same Pennsylvania town where he'd been born. The obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service, Purple Heart recipient, Vietnam veteran, wounded in action 1969, but devoted more space to his 43-year marriage, his children and grandchildren, his decades of community service, and his work helping fellow veterans navigate the bureaucratic maze of VA benefits. At his funeral, attended by over 200 people, his son David stood at the podium and said something that captured the essence of his father's journey. He lost his arm in Vietnam, but he never lost himself. The statement was both true and incomplete, because the fuller truth was more complex. Hartmann had lost himself, had spent years searching in darkness, and had ultimately rebuilt an identity from fragments, proving that survival was an ongoing act of courage rather than a single moment of endurance. The legacy of men like Hartmann extends far beyond individual biography. It resides in the broader narrative of what America asked of a generation, and how that generation carried the weight long after the helicopters stopped flying and the last troops came home. The Vietnam War produced over 58,000 American dead, their names etched on black granite in Washington. But it also produced over 150,000 wounded, men who came home missing limbs, sight, mobility, and pieces of their psyche that no surgery could repair. These walking wounded became living testimony to the true cost of war, not measured in body counts or strategic objectives, but in broken marriages, substance abuse, unemployment, homelessness, and suicide rates that continued climbing decades after the last shots were fired. The Veterans Administration estimated that by 2000, over 200,000 Vietnam veterans were homeless, and suicide rates among Vietnam veterans remained significantly higher than the general population. Hartmann's story mattered because he represented both the wound and the possibility of healing, both the trauma and the resilience that allowed some men to find purpose on the other side of devastation. The Battle of Hamburger Hill, where Hartmann lost his arm, became one of the most controversial engagements of the war. The 10-day assault in May 1969 cost 72 American lives and over 300 wounded to capture a hill that was abandoned shortly after, allowing North Vietnamese forces to reoccupy it within weeks. When news of the battle reached the American public, it crystallized growing opposition to the war. Senator Edward Kennedy called it senseless and irresponsible, and the backlash contributed to changes in U.S. military strategy, pushing toward Vietnamization and eventual withdrawal. The soldiers who fought there were caught in the contradiction, ordered to take an objective at tremendous cost, only to watch it surrendered for political reasons they weren't cleared to understand. For men like Hartmann, the question wasn't whether the sacrifice was worth it. How could it be, when the ground they bled for was immediately ceded back, but whether they could find personal meaning despite the strategic absurdity. The medical legacy of the Vietnam War transformed military and civilian medicine in ways that still resonate. The helicopter medevac system, which evacuated wounded soldiers from battlefield to hospital in under an hour, saved thousands of lives that would have been lost in previous conflicts. The survival rate for serious wounds in Vietnam was significantly higher than in World War II or Korea, thanks to rapid evacuation, improved surgical techniques, and advances in blood transfusion and antibiotic therapy. But survival came with complications. More men lived, but with catastrophic injuries, amputations, spinal cord damage, traumatic brain injuries that required lifetime care and adaptation. The VA hospital system, overwhelmed by the influx of disabled veterans, struggled to provide adequate physical and mental health services, a failure that prompted reforms but never fully closed the gap between need and resources. Hartmann's experience with prosthetics illustrated the trajectory. The crude mechanical hooks of 1969 gradually gave way to sophisticated myoelectric and eventually computerized prostheses. But the psychological adaptation remained constant, learning to be whole while missing pieces. The recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder as a formal diagnosis in 1980, 11 years after Hartmann came home, validated what combat veterans had known instinctively: that invisible wounds were as real and debilitating as physical ones. For decades, terms like shell shock and combat fatigue had pathologized normal human responses to abnormal violence, suggesting weakness rather than injury. The Vietnam War, with its guerrilla tactics, unclear front lines, and morally ambiguous missions, produced PTSD at rates higher than previous conflicts. Hartmann's nightmares, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt, and substance abuse were symptoms, not character flaws, and the eventual therapeutic interventions, group therapy, cognitive behavioral techniques, medication, represented medicine catching up to reality. His recovery, slow and incomplete though it was, paved paths for younger veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, proving that treatment worked and that asking for help was an act of courage, not surrender. Hartmann's personal legacy lived most vividly in the lives he touched after the war. Through his accounting work, he helped over 300 veteran-owned businesses navigate startup finances, tax complications, and the specific challenges faced by disabled entrepreneurs. Many of these veterans credited him with making the difference between success and bankruptcy, not just because of his financial acumen, but because he understood their struggles in ways civilian accountants never could. When a client showed up late because a panic attack had paralyzed him in traffic, Hartmann didn't judge. He rescheduled and shared his own coping strategies. When another veteran struggled with alcohol, Hartmann didn't lecture. He shared his own history with addiction and the phone number for his AA sponsor. His office became unofficial therapy, a space where military service was common language and vulnerability was strength. In his children and grandchildren, Hartmann's legacy took a different form. Emily became a high school history teacher who taught units on the Vietnam War, with a nuance often missing from textbooks, emphasizing the humanity of soldiers caught in political machinery beyond their control. David joined the VA as a social worker, specializing in veteran rehabilitation, driven by memories of his father's struggles and triumphs. The grandchildren grew up hearing stories, not glorified tales of heroism, but honest accounts of fear, loss, brotherhood, and the long road home. Hartmann never told them war was noble or necessary. He told them it was hell, and that the men who fight it deserve more than platitudes and parades. They deserve health care, housing, education, and a nation that remembers them after the flags stop waving. The broader historical legacy of the Vietnam War remains contested terrain. Unlike World War II, which American culture has framed as a good war, with clear moral stakes, Vietnam exists in national memory as tragedy, mistake, or necessary Cold War proxy, depending on political perspective. The soldiers who fought it were often caught in the crossfire of cultural interpretation, blamed by anti-war activists for atrocities they didn't commit, and ignored by a government eager to move on. The phrase, "thank you for your service," now ubiquitous when addressing veterans, emerged partly as penance for how Vietnam veterans were treated upon return, not with parades but with silence, hostility, or indifference. Hartmann experienced this firsthand. The VA bureaucracy that lost his paperwork repeatedly. The employers who saw his missing arm as liability rather than sacrifice. The strangers who asked if he'd killed anyone and expected entertaining answers. The cultural reckoning came slowly, beginning with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial dedication in 1982, and continuing through films, literature, and scholarship that complicated simplistic narratives. What endures, beyond politics and cultural debate, is the memory of individual courage under impossible circumstances. The men who fought on Hamburger Hill, in the A Shau Valley, and across Vietnam, didn't choose the war or its objectives. They answered when called, fought beside their brothers, and came home carrying wounds that never fully healed. They deserve to be remembered not as abstractions, statistics, symbols, political talking points, but as human beings who endured and adapted and survived. Michael J. Hartmann was one of millions, and his story was both unique and universal. The particulars of his life, the Pennsylvania town, the hardware store, the family, were his alone. But the arc of trauma and recovery, loss and rebuilding, was shared by a generation that learned to live with ghosts. In his final years, Hartmann occasionally spoke to high school history classes and veteran groups, always reluctantly, never comfortably. He didn't enjoy public speaking, didn't consider himself eloquent, and hated being called a hero. But he went because someone had to bear witness, to say out loud what the statistics couldn't capture. That war destroys more than it reveals, that the men who fight it are rarely the men who start it, and that coming home is sometimes harder than staying in combat. In one such talk, recorded by a student in 2015, and later transcribed by his daughter, he said something that captured the essential truth of his experience. "I lost my arm on May 17, 1969, but I've been losing and finding pieces of myself ever since. That's what survival means, not staying in one piece, but learning to live as the pieces you have left. The legacy, then, is not a monument or a medal, but a lived truth. That resilience is possible even after catastrophic loss. That healing is a journey without clear destination, and that the measure of a life isn't found in what was taken, but in what was built from what remained." Men like Michael J. Hartmann remind us that behind every statistic is a story, behind every scar is a struggle, and behind every survival is a choice made daily to keep going despite the weight. These stories matter. They connect us to a history that's too easy to forget, to sacrifices made by real people with names and families and futures that were interrupted or ended in jungles half a world away. When we remember them, we honor not just their service, but their humanity, the fear they felt, the courage they summoned, the pain they carried, and the lives they rebuilt or tried to rebuild when they came home. This isn't abstract history. It's lived experience that deserves preservation, understanding, and respect. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand even a fraction of what Vietnam veterans endured and survived, take a moment to share it. Like this video. Leave a comment honoring the Michael J. Hartmanns of the world. Men who gave pieces of themselves and spent lifetimes learning to be whole again. Subscribe to ensure these stories reach others, because every view, every share, every comment helps preserve the memory of men who deserve more than our nation's selective amnesia. These aren't just stories. They're sacred trusts, testimonies from those who walked through hell and came back to tell us what they saw. And the least we can do, the very least, is listen, remember, and ensure their sacrifices aren't forgotten in the convenience of historical distance. Honor their memory, share their stories. Keep the faith with those who kept faith with us.